In addition to thanking Charles, we also have to thank some of our friends that make the Mass Talk series possible. This evening we want to recognize the Institute for the Public Administration of Canada, the British Council, as well as the Mark News, which people should be checking out daily, themarknews.com. Tonight's event also anticipates a new string of work for Mass, which will properly launch this autumn. Mark October the 7th in your calendar. Plan to be at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, because we'll be bringing another Brit named Richard Wilkinson, who has, I think, an equally important book, and I can say that because it's cited at length towards the end of this book, called The Spirit Level, Why Equality is Better for Everyone. Wilkinson was on the TVO's agenda on Friday night. It just went up online. He gives us the very important insight that among OECD countries, Canada, regrettably, is the country which is becoming most unequal the fastest. And he's found some very powerful correlations between income inequality and the social determinants of health. So we're asking him to come to Ottawa with 20 other speakers from corporate Canada, from many of the think tanks and foundations and governments from across the country. We hope you'll be there to talk about these issues, ultimately about environmental and social sustainability. Also, I want to point out Tom Rand, who also has a book with us this evening. It's called Kick the Fossil Fuel Habit. Tom is a green entrepreneur working out of the Mars Center here in Toronto. He's someone I hope you'll have a chance to talk with later this evening. Tonight, Tim Jackson, Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey, which for all the As It Happens listeners is 36 miles from Reading. I'm glad that worked. He's also the director, I'll explain later, of the research group on lifestyles, values, and the environment, which has the handy acronym RESOLVE. And for over 20 years, Tim has been at the forefront of research and teaching in sustainability. In 1988, he pioneered a least cost approach to carbon abatement for Friends of the Earth. It's actually an interesting list of accomplishments here. In 1996, he co-authored the first index of sustainable economic welfare for the UK, and he continues to work closely with one of my favorite British think tanks, the New Economics Foundation, as well as on other measures of sustainable well-being. From 2004 to 2006, he was the sole academic representative on the UK Sustainable Consumption Roundtable, and in 2006 published the Earthscan Reader on sustainable consumption. He's also led the team which developed the model used to estimate the UK's carbon footprint for the Carbon Trust. We don't have a carbon trust in Canada, perhaps we should. He's also the co-author of the World Watch Institute's influential State of the World 2008 report on sustainable economies. In 2004, he was appointed the Economics Commissioner to the UK Sustainable Development Commission, a very important post, and he's contributed extensively to the Sustainable Development Strategy for the UK. And I love this last bit because it shows that he's not only concerned about the world and has a good mind for numbers and sums, but that in addition to his academic and policy work, he's an award-winning playwright with numerous BBC radio credits to his name. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome Tim Jackson. Now, I don't have as much of an economics background as I really wish I had, especially these days when we're watching about these billion and trillion dollar bailouts, where all of us are concerned about what's happening in Greece. We're watching inflation, we're watching mortgage rates. Everyone says that the answer to the recession we've just come through is more growth. And yet in your book, you say we can have prosperity without growth, and in fact, growth might well be the problem. So for the non-economists like me, what is it that traditional economists mean when they talk about growth, and why do you think we can do without it?
What they mean actually is it is one of the problems is that economists is not a homogeneous mass of people. It's a set of people with quite diverse views, in fact. So they do mean different things, but generally speaking, the consensus about growth is that it means growth in the gross domestic product, which is a measure of the economic activity in the economy, and the suggestion is that economic activity, because we basically buy all the things that come out of it and that makes our lives better, is a measure of our own well-being. So as the economy expands, so does the quality of our lives, our living standards. Things are getting better and better into the future. And that's the concept of prosperity, really, that sits at the heart of economics and has sat at the heart of economics for 40 or 50 years, possibly 200 years, really. And so why do they think we want it? Because they think it will make our lives better. But also, interestingly, because we don't know how to make economies work when they're not growing. So there's an element of reliance on this ever increasing pie, so that even if it isn't actually all that we want, we might never find that out because we're so hooked on the stability that economic growth gives us.
Now, in the last century, that growth has delivered a lot of good things, from the Industrial Revolution in other parts of the world today, which are on a strong growth curve. What is it that's wrong about growth and that expansion?
Well, let's accept. I mean, I think we should. You have to accept that it's done some fantastic things. For better health, better education, better housing, not for everyone. I mean, the whole question of inequality and the lessons from the fact that we haven't managed to create equal societies are really important ones. So I'm glad that you've got Richard Wilkinson coming, and that work is fantastic. So accepting we've had those benefits, and accepting that there are some countries that desperately still need those benefits. 2 billion people living on less than the price of a cappuccino every day, and that degree of absolute poverty has to be a priority social concern. It has to be a part of any sense of creating a fair and equal society. So I think it's really well worth saying, yes, I accept absolutely that growth has delivered some benefits in terms of well-being, and I accept absolutely that income growth is a part of bringing poor nations out of poverty. But the real constraint on all that, the constraint on that just going bigger and bigger and bigger, is actually a very basic one. It's about simple system dynamics, and the ever-expanding system, subsystem, of a finite, let's call that the economy, the expanding subsystem of a finite system, let's call that the planet, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. It does not compute. So this bigger and bigger and bigger system sitting within the constraints of a finite planet is a recipe for disaster. And actually we already see some of that disaster in the form of climate change, deforestation, water quality reductions, the decimation of forests, the degradation of soils, the acidification of the oceans. We're looking at already the beginnings of that does not compute. We're looking at that place where the ever-expanding economy meets the finite boundaries of the planet. And so that's really, that's a fundamental place to be. It's a place we've not really been in before, because the economy was small enough and the planet was big enough that we really didn't see the impact of it.
Now, warnings about the kind of finitude of the earth are not new, and you acknowledge Malthus, right? And you acknowledge the work of the Club of Rome and limits to growth. This warning has been sounded periodically through the Industrial Revolution and today. What's different about now?
I think what's different about now is scale, really. Actually the limits to growth people, incredibly interesting, because essentially, 3 or 4 decades ago, they saw the writing on the wall, and they produced for the first time a sort of sense of when the chickens might come home to roost, when these limits might approach, and they didn't get it that far wrong, although there was fantastic debate about it. Actually, the predictions of resource scarcities in the early years of this millennium are not that far off what we might expect to see, and may already have seen in some resources. So the only thing that's happened in the intervening decades since the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth report is nothing, a whole load of nothing in relation to the messages that they were bringing to the world. A sense actually that we could escape, that our cleverness, our ability, our technological ability would allow us to escape from this trap. And through the 80s and 90s in particular, we had this enormous sense of technological optimism that we could somehow, just by being the clever species that we are, we could do things more efficiently. And in fact, we had an economy that prizes efficiency, so it should be a pretty easy thing to deliver in such an economy that we do things more and more efficiently. And if you look at the data, actually, you find that we did do things more efficiently. The trouble is, we did more of them. So we have this kind of race between efficiency and scale, and all of the data tells you the same thing, that scale runs faster than efficiency. So the overall impact has just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the answer to your question, why now? Why is it important now? Because we didn't listen to those messages, we didn't take any notice of them, we believed we were clever enough to escape them, and we're now faced with resource scarcities, climate instability and so on.
If we think, I mean, especially in this province right now, which has announced a fairly ambitious green energy plan, maybe not ambitious enough, but already it's facing real resistance. And we hear, I mean, Scientific American a couple of issues back said, here's how you do green energy through the world, and it would cost this much, and we've spent this much on big projects before, let's get on with it. So I'm not able to assess the technical veracity of that plan, but it seems to me that the problem isn't technological often as much as it is political.
There is a political problem. Don't get me wrong about technology, because I absolutely believe that we need to have a range of technologies, particularly around renewable energy, low carbon energy, cleaner energy, in order to create any kind of transition to a sustainable economy. So those are things that have to happen, and we know, in fact, we've known for at least since the oil shocks of the 1970s and 80s that kind of stuff matters, and that is important. And you're right in the sense that, you know, the difficulty is political, in that we haven't had the political will to take those technologies where they need to go. But actually, when you unpack that political will, often what you find is that the political will itself is constrained by the demands of the economy. In other words, it's constrained by the demands of a particular economic system that has to keep growing, and it has to keep growing at a certain rate in order to maintain stability, and government's political will actually has to make sure that keeps happening. So it's not just that we need technological transition, we need technological transition in this existing model of growth that doesn't interfere anywhere with the structures of growth. And that's problematic, because the structures of growth are built very much around this expansion of free fossil energy, the availability of energy, almost the wastefulness of it in creating all the goods and services that will grow the economy no matter what, no matter whether we want it or not, simply in order to keep stability. So it is, you're right, it's a question of political will. But the political will is hard to arrive at, because politicians themselves are locked into this same dynamic, the dynamic of the growth-based economy.
We'll come to the new paradigm that you propose in a moment, but I want to talk about this idea. You have a whole chapter called The Myth of Decoupling, and decoupling, economics term. Explain it, what people mean and why you think it's a myth.
Yeah, what do they mean? I mean, it's a lovely term. It's amazing actually how unintuitive it is, that people just don't really get it. And maybe that's that should have been an indication all along. But the idea of decoupling is basically it's dollars we want in the economy, right? It's more and more incomes. So let's keep dollars rising. So economic output measured in dollars keeps rising. And it's materials we're concerned about, right? It's the environmental impacts. So let's try and push material impacts down and down and down. So dollars go up, materials go down. That's decoupling, basically. So we've decoupled the material impacts from, well, how do you get to it is the interesting question. I mean, this is, the efficiency is a part of it. Efficiency is something called relative decoupling. So for each dollar of economic output, I only need a certain amount of carbon emissions for each dollar. So that's relative efficiency. If I can make that number, the carbon per dollar, or if I can make the dollar per carbon go up and the carbon per dollar go down, that's efficiency improvement. And actually, if you look at it, you find we've done it. We have reduced the carbon intensity of global economic activity by about a third over the last 3 to 4 decades. So that's got to be a good news story. Except, of course, that over the same period, the world economic output has increased by a bigger number. So
Right.
we actually have carbon going up, even though we got more and more efficient. And the one thing we don't have, in almost anything you look at, is the impacts going down. So we've still got this happening, and sometimes our material impacts are not quite so fast growing because we've got efficiency, but what we never see is this. We don't see anything like that. And if you ask how fast you have to make those numbers, that technological decoupling run in order to get below your carbon targets, the numbers are huge. It's daunting. I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, just one example, for example, if you want to meet our carbon targets by the middle of this century, and you imagine there's going to be 9 billion people in the world, which is the mid-range UN expectation, 9 billion people, and let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that we think it's ethically just that all those 9 people should achieve the same income level as, let's say, Western Europe, still growing at 2% per annum because we still want a growth-based economy. Then you have to, the trick of decoupling, the technological trick of decoupling that you have to pull off is enormous. It means reducing the carbon intensity from around 770 grams of carbon per dollar to less than 6 in the space of 40 years. And that is something faster by well over an order of magnitude than anything we have ever achieved historically. And then if the economy is still growing, of course, you've got to push that number down and down and down and down until by the second half of this century, you have to have carbon intensity that is less than 0. Whatever that means. I mean, if you're anything like me, negative numbers kind of, stare you in the face and you think, hang on, what does a negative carbon intensity mean? I'll tell you, it means basically every dollar of economic activity, instead of pumping carbon into the atmosphere, has to be pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, which is a sort of just extraordinary place to be. We have no idea what this economy looks like. We don't know what its technologies are, what its resource base is, how it's organized, what people are spending their money on, how society looks in an economy that's pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So that, to me, is why it's a myth. It's like, I absolutely agree that decoupling is essential, but the mythical idea that the direction our economy is going will somehow deliver automatically this technological revolution is not just mythical, it's kind of a form of magical thinking, it's fanciful.
So when we read someone like Tom Friedman in the New York Times has been talking about how they need a green energy and green economic revolution in the US, and he talks about ET being the new IT, we should say, nice, but not good enough.
Absolutely. Nice, essential, but not good enough. And I mean, it is fantastic. I mean, this is one of the difficult places in a way, because you don't want to put these guys off when they suddenly get something that we've been talking about for the last 30 or 40 years. And I went to, earlier this year, I was in a conference from the National Council for Science and Environment, and Lisa Jackson, the head of the US EPA, stood up, and she gave actually what was a fairly inspirational speech talking about the need to transform our energy systems. And in the 25 years that I've been working, I heard nothing like it from a senior administration official, either in Europe or in the US. And so I find that immensely encouraging. And yet it is abundantly clear that the thinking has to go beyond that actually implementing that scale of transition without thinking about the structure of what the economy is doing is still locked a little bit in that kind of fanciful thinking mode.
Now, I think, we've all been the beneficiary in one way or the other of the kind of leadership that the UK has shown and the number of initiatives, whether it's Carbon Trust, whether it's the Stern Review, whether it's some of the British government's commitments to climate change. Why has the UK maybe carried this ball a little bit further than other industrial economies?
Well, first of all, I mean, I don't think we should be under any illusions that it's really a groundbreaking pioneer about to revolutionise its own economy.
Especially this week.
Especially, this long week of not really knowing if we have a government or not. But it is a really interesting question, because I think what happened was that the UK, at the time that the Kyoto Protocol was signed, particularly the main instrument for the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UK saw a political opportunity to give political leadership in Europe and in the world around that. And believe me, that itself was quite a revolutionary thing, because for decades Britain was the dirty man of Europe. So suddenly, actually, and here's an opportunity to turn it around, actually, to give yourself a good reputation in Europe as a leader. And we were able to do it partly because we had a very dirty coal industry over 150 years, very dirty energy system. And we had discovered North Sea gas and oil. And it actually revolutionised the energy system in the UK for a short window of time, a few decades, brought down the carbon intensity of our economy and allowed us to feel confident that we could bring down our carbon targets, show political leadership, and really take a stance in the world at an important international protocol. So that's what we did, and John Prescott particularly, I mean, was in the negotiation for the protocol was tireless. I mean, he was like a bulldog out there, fighting the corner. And then we were committed to that, and there we were suddenly at the heart of this kind of groundbreaking protocol, saying the UK is going to lead the way, the Labour Party is going to take that on. We had a manifesto commitment from the Labour Party that was bigger than the Kyoto commitment that we'd signed up to. And then they started doing the sums. And they realised actually it was going to be tougher because the premium from the transition to gas was running out, because actually domestic demand was expanding. But strangely, even so, we were kind of looking at that stuff, saying, well, no, we've put our colours to the mast here. We're going to go now, with quite a lot of lobbying from the environmental groups, for a groundbreaking Climate Change Act. So we went for that. A lot of politicians kind of running fast to catch up with, well, hang on a minute, what is carbon? What's climate change? How do we get that into our legislation? What does it mean to have legislation? But a continuing sort of sense of political momentum. And then by 2008, suddenly, we actually have climate change legislation. We have an act which commits the government to achieving certain targets by 2050, with interim targets on the way. And I think this is the point at which, you know, the politicians really sat down and said, hang on a minute, how do we do this? So what does the government do when it doesn't know how to achieve something? It sets up a committee. And it sets up the Climate Change Committee. And the Climate Change Committee is charged with saying, how do we deliver this? How do we deliver it? And they're struggling with all this stuff now. And I've had meetings in Treasury when I've spoken to Treasury ministers about the need to think about the economic systems, and they go, well, yes, we accept those arguments, but now we've got the Climate Change Act and we've set up the Climate Change Committee, so let's just wait and see what the Climate Change Committee says about delivering the Climate Change Act and what we need to do. And I think the reality is that still, even in the UK, we got all the stuff there, we got all the architecture, but it is going to be a big ask. And so we've got almost the UK, to me, sort of personifies that conflict between understanding the need for these social environmental goals, and yet at the same time being locked in a growth paradigm. In fact, you could argue that the UK was at the heart of what led to the financial crisis. You know, growth built on the expansion of the financial sector that ultimately became devastatingly unstable and unravelled our sense of where the stability of our economy was. And yet at the same time, you know, really quite deeply committed to these climate goals. It's absolutely fascinating kind of politics. To me, it sort of calls up what Karl Polanyi called the double movement of society, that capitalism has created this forward-thinking, growth-based economy that politicians need because it provides economic stability, and find at the same time that it constantly comes up against their very legitimate defence of other environmental and social goals, and this sense almost of a conflicted state, a divided state of mind that is struggling with having, you know, through this slightly conflicted, divided set of priorities, having committed itself to something it doesn't quite know how to deliver. It's going to be interesting times.
Well, it's a very divided political system right now.
Even
at this hour, we don't know who the government is and who the next Prime Minister will be. Let's just stick with British politics then for one more moment, because I can't help but wonder whether this is actually a really good moment for you or a really bad moment for you. something we can understand in Ontario, British government is borrowing 1 in 4 pounds. This year, we're borrowing $1 in 4 for a provincial budget. Your debt load is a lot higher than ours. And it means that whoever takes the helm come Monday is going to have to make some pretty serious decisions. And is it going to be a conventional approach where there are cutbacks and there's a go for growth? Or is this actually a transition moment where the right people might be there at the right time to set things on a course that you would recommend? Is there any possibility of that right now? Or is everything just on the back foot right now until the economy stabilizes?
I think the reality is that most things are on the back foot. I mean, the one thing that comes out of the hung parliament that is really quite promising, I think, is that it will almost inevitably involve the Lib Dems as the party holding the balance of power. And the one person through the financial crisis who, I mean, he just became the most trusted politician in the UK because he just said it straight down the line, was the Lib Dem spokesman on the economy, so Vince Cable, and just an enormously experienced, very clear-sighted politician who was very outspoken about what was going on, and the sense that, you know, the different things needed to happen, particularly in the structure of the financial markets. And those are critical things to do. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that that is a part of the transition to a more sustainable economy. So having Vince Cable there, if he's there, having some influence, if he has some influence, could be a sort of groundbreaking moment in itself. But don't make any mistake, really, that, you know, that will revolutionise the drive for growth. I still don't think it will. I still think most of the demands, most of the immediate demands on an incoming government are, they'll be dealing with rising deficit, rising public sector debt. They'll be dealing with the need for public sector cuts. They will be dealing with rising unemployment because of the nature of the economic structure and the way that it inevitably drives people out of work through a recession. And they will be dealing actually possibly with financial needs in relation to climate change that are unprecedented precisely because we have this climate change legislation. So that's a big set of demands, and I think it explains a lot of why, at this point in time at least, government's biggest commitment is please, 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 let's just get us back to growth and get us back, get everybody out shopping, get people active in the economy, get people back into jobs that we know we need to get by raising demand, by having people going out shopping, and then we will know where we are. You know, then we'll know what this.
Then we can afford.
I mean, it is. Well, the reality is, of course, we can't afford it. We can't afford it in ecological terms. We don't know how to make the economy work beyond this unstable expansion of the financial sector that we've had for the last 15 years. We don't really know how to achieve it, even in conventional terms. But at least there's a sense of comfort in hanging on to that belief that that's where we can go.
But it's got to be enormously frustrating for you as you talk to chancellors and you talk to people at the UN, and you understand, you're sympathetic about where they're at and the time that this will take. But you also know the kind of carbon countdown that we're on, and that the time isn't there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of panic around the carbon countdown, and I sort of understand it. But carbon isn't the only issue. I mean, you know, the issues around energy security, issues around biodiversity, issues around other resource consumption, issues around land and water and forests and soils. And actually, almost, I mean, it's a difficult thing to say in a way, but almost we shouldn't be too obsessed with carbon. What we should be trying to do, what we should be throwing our energy into, above everything else, is actually developing the basis for a different kind of economy. And of course a part of that is carbon, and of course a lot of the solutions to carbon actually hit some of that other stuff as well, particularly if you can bring down energy demand. Then you're hitting all sorts of other issues in a very, very good way, and you're going in exactly the right direction. So the carbon thing is important, but this idea actually of building the political space to have a different kind of economy seems to be the absolutely core task.
Let's talk about that different kind of economy. then and exactly what prosperity without growth looks like. We've heard lots of different proposals. Peter Victor's excellent work on managing without growth from York University here in Toronto talks about a slow or low growth economy for Canada. He's projected out where it would include job share, for instance, similar to what they experimented with but didn't get so far with in France. But what else would make up this kind of prosperous, no growth?
Well, let me start. Let me just kind of sketch something for you, because the one thing that to me, there's a couple of key things. One is around investment, and the other is around a sort of service-based economy. The service-based economy comes straight from that idea of decoupling. If what is at issue is not the dollars going up, but the material impacts, and we want to bring those down, then let's not create an economy at just selling each other widgets and junk. Let's create an economy around exchanging human services. So around health, education, social care, leisure activities, maybe hairdressing, yoga, I don't know, fill it in yourself in a way, but a set of activities that could be materially light, less carbon intensive, less materials intensive, and could contribute to a sense of flourishing in the economy, and could support communities, build resilience back into communities, and could provide jobs. These activities, these service-based activities, could provide the basis for another economy. And this is not a new idea, it's been around quite a while, this servicisation. So that's the one idea. And then it is different, though, from the way we think about the engine of growth at the moment.
Right.
So let me just try and tease you through that idea. It's a little bit complex, but basically investment plays a very specific role in the existing system. And it basically goes something like this. We invest partly in order to maintain our capital stock and keep it going, but also to do two things. One is to chase labour productivity. More and more output per unit of a person's work. And this chasing of labour productivity brings prices down, allows us to sell people, encourages people to buy more stuff because the prices are lower, and begins to drive a kind of an engine of growth, if you like. And then the other thing that we do with this investment is what Joseph Schumpeter, an economist from the early 20th century, called creative destruction. It's about throwing over all the old stuff as fast as we can to create new stuff, new processes, new products, new consumer gadgets. The latest iPod, car, house device that shows people, essentially, that we're moving forwards. This is progress, the throwing over of the old in favour of the new, the creation of novelty. And why this is really interesting, because it turns out that as human beings, you and I, in fact, we have something of an appetite for novelty. We like it, we love it, it signals, that it plays a role in status competition, it signals that we're decent human beings, we have got the latest stuff, it tells society that we're part of that social world, we're participating in it, and we're enjoying it. And what's more, it signals a kind of sense of hope. Things are getting better and newer and brighter and shinier, and we are creating a better world, if not for us, for our children. But what you've got through that is a really complex dynamic in the system. An economic structure built around the production of novelty, a social logic around the consumption of novelty, a very, very hard place to get out of. So hard to get out of it that we've even encouraged a system where we all get more and more heavily into debt and draw down our savings faster and faster. Just before the crisis, the savings rate in the UK plummeted to below zero, just so that we can keep this consumption cycle going. This is what investment is doing. It's driving this consumption cycle in this very particular way, locked in. And just to paraphrase completely, what is the story of that economy? It is basically something like this. It's that people, you and I, are being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. and that's what we're doing. That's what we're and we're doing it in pursuit of what? In pursuit of an economy that is driving financial instability and that is totally ecologically unsustainable. So one of the key ideas in the book is really to take this concept of investment out again and to say this is not what investment is. Investment is a relationship. It's our relationship. It's our primary economic relationship between the present and the future. It is the place, actually, where the transformation of the economy has to take place. And to say, actually, that what we need at this point desperately is a form and a structure of investment that will build the infrastructure, the technology, the public space, the public goods that will create a decent society to live in. So these two planks, really, of a service-based economy and a concept of ecological investment, these are transformative concepts. The one thing about both of them, you could say, well, could we do that and growth? Could we keep those things and have growth? Because people just are so reluctant to lose sight of this concept. And actually, as you look at both those concepts, and I won't go into the technicalities of it, but the basics is that you can have the foundations for a strong economy, you can have full employment, you can have resilient communities, you can reduce your impact on the world, but the one thing that's difficult to get back is simple out-and-out growth because of the way that those dynamics work. So in other words, that's what we have to let go of. Just maybe we'll get back growth, maybe we'll be incredibly clever at services, maybe we'll be incredibly productive in ecological investment, maybe we'll get back growth, but that's not the point. The point is, for the moment, put it out of your mind because it's leading us astray and it's stopping us seeing these really strong, transformative notions that could be a new economy.
Now, you're not just talking about pushing the pause button in the developed West, or are you?
Not at all, because I mean, what's abundantly clear actually is, you know, that we're living in a deeply interlinked economies, and we're also living in a deeply interlinked environment. So the problem of climate change is clearly a global problem, and so one of the things actually we need for ecological investment to be doing is to be investing in transition in other economies.
Right.
In particular,
because so much of China's growth right now is
dedicated to the consumer stuff
North
that's
America.
coming back at us.
Absolutely. So, next week you're called in to meet with the new British Chancellor.
Is that right?
Could well be.
Cameron. Announced today.
It was announced today.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It
Well,
is.
did they announce that I was being called in?
We'll take up a petition later on, or maybe Flaherty, our minister here. Top things that you would advise them to focus on right now, and then we're going to get some questions.
Yeah.
from
No,
you.
I think probably if I were to choose three things, I would say the space, just political space. Open out this space because we know our economies are broken. We know that we are too close to environmental limits. We know that we are undermining quality of life by this pursuit of increasing materialism. So we desperately need that space. Just create something, for goodness sake. I go into the Treasury and I see floor after floor of Treasury analysts all doing the stuff that's associated with figuring out how to get the economy to grow. Just give me a quarter of one floor, a small space in there, where economists are doing something different, where they're trying to understand the implications of a resource-constrained, environmentally constrained economy, where they're trying to build stability in a way that doesn't rely on growth. Just give me that space.
Is there this
Very,
department
very
in a
little.
ministry in any country that gives you some hope?
Well, actually, I mean, even in the UK, and there are places where they hope. I mean, there's actually immediately following the launch of our report a year ago, the initial report that led to the book, they immediately set up a working group on sustainability and economic growth. But DEFRA, the Department of the Environment, is it's all about rankings, really. It's all about, you know, Treasury's up here, the Business and Industry Department is here, and DEFRA is down here. So DEFRA sets up a little group on growth and sustainability, and they immediately get sort of questioning looks from up here. Hang on a minute, what are you guys doing down there? And because they're not that high in the rankings, they sort of say, oh no, nothing, we're just trying to show that we can have a growth-based economy and meet all our environmental limits. And so they get a word back which says, did you say limits? Is that really the word that you're using to describe the environmental conditions of the economy? And now, DEFRA themselves, although they've established this little growth and economy working group, are nervous of using the language of limits and looking upwards to Treasury to say, don't worry, we're not going to stamp on your toes in relation to growth. So there's elements of promise and hope, but you need those to be in Treasury. You need them to be up here. This is where you need the thinking to be. And there my sort of sense of hope is based around actually a sort of subculture. This is a sense I have, that there is, the logic of this is so clear in some ways that it's very, very hard for sensible, clever people to ignore it forever. And so you still can't talk about it openly in Treasury, but you can attend a seminar given by some guy called Tim Jackson who wrote some report that everybody seems to be talking about. And actually, this is not, I have to say, this is not the first time I've been in standing room only. The first time I was in standing room only, interestingly, to talk about this stuff was in the Treasury, in the UK Treasury. Now I have to say that there were only 8 chairs in the room. Before you get too excited, I think they thought that the market for chairs would reduce this scarcity problem, but unfortunately it didn't respond fast enough. But having said that, actually the people who did crowd into the room were there with an interest. They were there with a real, this kind of mood, a sense that things have changed. Actually, is not still there at the top level, but it's there kind of underneath, and the sense of inquiry is beginning to take place. So that, number one is that build that political space. It's kind of almost Kevin Costner and build it and they will come kind of thing. It's that sort of sense of having the space.
But some other economists are starting to step into this. And just last week, Juliet Shore with her new book, Plenitude, the New Economics of True Wealth. Like, it feels as though there's some intellectual momentum.
There's definitely, but there's been an intellectual momentum for quite a long time, and I think what we're seeing is that intellectual momentum spilling into the institutions of government, with a lot of nervousness still around it, but a sort of sense that it has enough public appetite, enough political appetite to be at least worth exploring. So, that would be one, would be build that space. 2 and 3, I think, would be restructure this idea of investment. We desperately need financial markets to be working in the service of real investment in this transition. The moment there is no way that they're doing that. There's no way, even that the very well-intentioned small-scale community investment funds trying to produce security in local energy supply, there's no way they can flourish in a climate which sucks capital into this high-end, fast return, risky stuff that has led to financial collapse. We desperately need that financial reform. And then the third thing would be really around this idea of supporting resilience in the local service-based communities, service-based enterprises that are resource-light, that employ people and give security in relation to people's jobs, that support communities and allow people to flourish within them, set up the structures to make that work. And those 3 things, I think, would be transformative.
Great. I suspect there are a number of questions here in the audience, so why don't we take a few of them now? Yeah. Introduce yourself too.
Sure. My name's Jim Harris, former leader of the Green Party of Canada and a columnist for the National Post. A tremendous amount of frustration looking at McKinsey's cost abatement cost curve. I'm very excited to hear you did that work years ago in the UK, because it shows that 40% of the CO2 we have to reduce to meet our Kyoto goals can be achieved at a profit. And if those societal profits were invested in the next least cost solutions, we could achieve all our Kyoto goals at 0 cost to society. Now, it's different industries that get benefit and cost, but whatever. But my question is, if 40% of what we could do is profitable and it's not being done, is this not, as Nick Stern said, the greatest market failure of our economy? And if business is not even doing what's profitable to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what actions do we really need to take to drive those? I mean, Stern and Gore say we need to put a price on carbon because we need to increase the paybacks to the delta between, or mitigate risk, businesses will launch into this. But what would be your, top 3 things we need to do to get business to do what it's not even profitably doing right now? It's quite frustrating for me.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. I mean, and you're right. I mean, I did those MAC curves, the first MAC curve for the UK 21 years ago, and obviously, if I had the financial foresight of McKinsey Global Institute, I would be slightly better off now than I am today, since it's a very lucrative business, doing MAC curves. I did those MAC curves, and then I basically looked at why that. I asked myself exactly that question: why is it not happening? Are those profits illusory? Do they really exist? Are they a part? Is there a market failure? Yes, there is a market failure, and it's not just the price of carbon that's the market failure. Actually, it's the way that you glossed over it in a way, but it is the way those incentive structures are set up, the separation of costs from benefits, the separation of principal actors from the people who need to make the changes. It's a set of structural obstacles, it's a set of demands on management that have just not put together in the right places where those profits lie and where their own activities, their responsibility for achieving those profits lie. It's all sorts of complex things, but it's also is a part of this, one of the principal problems it seemed to me as I looked at it was part of the same dynamic, that there are profits to be made in resource productivity, but they compete for capital constantly against profits that have been made elsewhere in the economy. And those profits to be made elsewhere in the economy often have higher and faster rates of return and are often consumptive of resources. So even as you push little bits of capital into that resource productive bit, you're still fighting, you're still running down the up escalator, or probably up the down escalator, which is an even harder task, because the rest of your economy is going in the wrong direction. So yes, those efficiency savings, I believe, are there, but because of the way that we've structured capital markets, the way that capital is going, the way that actually every time you make an efficiency improvement, you release more spending into the economy on possibly more resource-intensive activities, the so-called rebound effect. We've seen efficiency improvement, we've seen it time and time again, but we haven't seen that transformation that the McKinsey curves suggest. And I think it's fantastic, even though I did the first one, I think it's fantastic microeconomic analysis. It ignores the dynamics of the system, and that's what we have to change.
Great question. Someone else? At the back.
I was listening to you, Art, if I understood you correctly, that as we move into a future economy, a good thing would be less reliance on sort of manufacturing and consumerism and more into service. And you mentioned specifically hairdressing, yoga, etc. But in an economic downturn, aren't those exactly the areas of the economy that are going to suffer most? People start cutting their own hair, they start getting their own interior decorating. So my concern would be that moving forward, especially in this environment of great financial uncertainty, that if we're going to have global retraction in the economy, similar or to some degree is what we're seeing in Greece, where everybody's got less, that those are the areas, as opposed to buying a car, but, buying a winter coat, that those are the areas that are the most expendable, in fact.
Expendable, perhaps, in terms of people's priorities.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Not, I think, expendable in terms of a concept for a different kind of economy. I think the logic of your argument is to suggest that we'll go back, if we go back anywhere, to an economy that's built around cars and winter coats and all the material paraphernalia. And to me, that's a recipe for disaster. So my suggestion of this service-based economy, essentially, Herman Daly made this point, 30, 40 years ago, that actually, and it is the default response to the fact that we've got material limits to economic activity, is to say we need dematerialized economies. So what are dematerialized economies? They're things that are around the exchange of services. Will we get those in the conventional economic structure and social logic, if that's the question you're asking, I think you're right. We won't. We have to be able to support those activities, and we have to, in fact, reverse, almost consciously, the culture of consumerism that suggests that it's the material stuff that we keep and the services that we throw away. But that won't happen. I mean, it won't happen without structural intervention. I think that's absolutely clear. And, you know, I mean, one of the things that your question raises for me, it's a really interesting point, is how much of that actually is truly economic activity. That idea of taking hairdressing, just as an example, it's a quite trivial one in a way, but taking it out of the formal economy and bringing it into an informal economy. Actually, cutting your own hair is pretty difficult. It's much easier if you cut it, you know, exchange it in informal terms with someone who's had some training in hairdressing, and then you do whatever, you know, in exchange to them. But that idea of informal activities that are not about monetary exchange, that are in fact about the provision of services between people, doesn't go away, actually. It becomes more integrated into a more localized and less monetarized sense of economy. And to me, that's not a bad thing. It's a sense of saying there are activities here that matter to people, there are services that people exchange. These themselves can provide resilience at the community level and can support people in times, as you suggest, of crisis.
I just want to suggest, further to the idea of providing services, you could provide, I think it was Thomas Edison who first came with this idea of providing the service of luminance rather than of light bulbs, and of selling you that object. So perhaps if you're looking at it in the terms of service, you can dematerialize by providing, you know, the service of transportation rather than a car or that.
That's exactly actually how I came into that sort of idea in the service-sized economy. It wasn't just me, there were lots of people talking about it, but that sense that actually, you know, people, what do you want? Do you want a lump of do you want a barrel of oil in your living room? Do you want a lump of kilowatt hours, you know, spooned down a lightning rod conducted into your life? Of course you don't. You want the services that these things provide, and that concept of the services provided by energy goods, by material resources, is a really powerful one. The place that takes you, though, is that in order to, and it could go a long way, in fact, to delivering that McKinsey curve, zero and negative cost carbon savings, is you have to transform the business model. You actually have to have companies whose financial interest isn't built around supplying more and more units of electricity or supplying more and more oil or cars. And that's a place of, you know, of radical structural change, and it's been resisted fiercely. We almost, in the UK, we got almost to that point of the government accepting this idea and applying an almost groundbreaking piece of legislation that would have transformed the energy companies into energy service companies, would have made it their responsibility, in fact, to bring down energy demand, to supply households with energy efficiency, to create that transition and share the economic benefits of being at that place on the McKinsey cost curve where there are productive returns between the company and the household. So people pay less for energy, the company gets more because they can charge a higher unit price for energy, even though the household's paying less overall. People have better thermal comfort. That kind of structural transformation is the basis of thinking differently about this service-sized economy. It's incredibly thoughtful.
So, what happened?
What happened? This was one of the most frustrating episodes of my engagement with the Sustainable Development Commission, and we had talked with government about this. It was called the supplier obligation. The jargon was called the supplier obligation. So the suppliers, the energy suppliers, would face an obligation, in fact, to reduce carbon within their customer base by a certain amount. They would have a cap, essentially. And since sales of energy is, in fact, carbon, that meant a cap on sales of energy. And so it would have radically transformed the way they operate. And there was a process that a very good friend of mine actually chaired this process, which got the big four energy companies down around the table, with a couple of the small ones as well. And they sort of said, well, if it's a level playing field, if we know where we are, if you give us the mechanisms, then yeah, we'll come along with you. And at that point in time, the Department of the Environment came up with a Mickey Mouse in-house piece of economic analysis that suggested that this wouldn't work. Now, who pulled that string or twisted their arm or where that came from, I have no idea. But I've never seen such a really very, very... I wouldn't... If an undergraduate had come to me with that as an assignment, I would have failed it. And here it was, sat at the heart of this thing, and it was all that was needed, really, to undermine, apparently, a consensus amongst the suppliers that this was a good place to be.
We'll take 2 more questions. At the back.
Yeah, my name's Mike Trainer, and I have a question that relates to the issue of how do you reduce demand, and if you have some suggestions around the policy instruments to do that, and I'll say something somewhat controversial, I guess, is that, you know, we should be proud in Ontario that we're moving along a green energy path, but it's quite expensive, quite frankly, and a much more cost-effective path would actually be to reduce demand, substantially more expensive, yet that's not the path we've chosen. And I think part of it is related to this growth model. It's easier to say, you know what, we're going to produce more energy, and so now we're just going to produce more energy, it just happens to be green energy, rather than to say we're actually going to reduce demand and produce less energy, even though it's the more cost-effective approach.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have some comments on that, and then maybe some policy tools that could reframe that discussion so we would move along a path towards reducing demand.
Yeah. I mean, you can sort of separate that. It's a really interesting question. I think you can separate it actually into a purely psychological thing. You know, that actually we're still stuck on this idea that growth is the right thing to do. I mean, it's bizarre the more you think about it. And the more I'm exposed to this dialogue around growth, and the more I'm exposed to people who, whenever you talk about the very sensible, grounded ideas, still want to pull it back to, but we can keep growth, can't we? The more I think there is actually something deeply psychological going on, which is pathological, because growth in that sense doesn't happen in biological systems. It just doesn't work that way. So this idea that we've hung on to suddenly, that it's the right thing, it's a sense of progress, it's a metaphor for progress, just to keep growing. I think there is a bit of a psychology around that, and I think you're absolutely right to say, you know, we can achieve that because we're growing a whole new industry, and that means a whole new set of jobs, and that I'm not knocking that, because that's really important to grow that industry. But to me, the momentum that appears, the psychological momentum that appears behind that, actually, it has a sort of attractiveness to politicians and to policymakers, that this steady, grounded, relentless work of improving energy efficiency doesn't quite excite them in the same way. So the policy levers, it seems to me, I mean, there are a number of policy levers. One thing that we know that we need in order to achieve that energy efficiency revolution is actually skilling. We need to skill a whole set of people who know how to do this stuff, because at the moment, actually, we don't have, in fact, the capacity to deliver that kind of transformation in energy efficiency. And another thing we have to do is to build the financial structure for it, because we know that it's capital intensive, and we know actually that the capital at the moment, because of the way that capital is pulled, tends to fight shy of it. And we know that it's also distributed. So it's what do we need? We need across communities. We need investment to be going in that's accessible to householders who don't have to cope with the hassle factor themselves, but actually could transform the quality of their housing, the quality of their lives, through very, very simple measures. And we need the people in order to carry that out. Now, that seems a fairly straightforward task until actually you ask who puts up the capital. And the trouble there is if you say, well, actually it's government that should put up the capital, then you ask, well, how do they finance that capital? And if they can't reap themselves, government can't reap any of the financial rewards from the energy savings, then they're less likely to put up the capital. So, I mean, there are, in fact, some arguments that say this would have been a fantastic stimulus because it could have put money back into the pockets of people in the economy, and that would have got people out, doing what government said they wanted to do, buying. So that's, one of the arguments that's been said. But most of the time, actually, and perhaps now increasingly, it means government finding money that it doesn't have in order to create investment vehicles that make sense at community level. And there, I think you're drawn into one of the most interesting things about this debate, which is there is an ideological thing going on here. If you stop, if you think that your only means of delivering goods and services in the economy is private interest, and you stop those private interest companies becoming service-based companies, or even don't even think about telling them to become service-based companies, and you don't allow for any of the financial rewards from this to flow back into the public sector, you just don't have the mechanisms. You know, very simple things, the ideology of growth, the ideology of private capital interest, the failure to skill people up appropriately, and the complete lack of financial mechanisms that would achieve this transformation. And it goes back to exactly that first question. These are the things sitting in the way of reaping the economic benefits from resource efficiency. But actually, the very, very simple things that you can do to fix it, and some of them are just psychological.
Take one last question. Yeah, in the front.
Wouldn't peak oil correct the situation regardless, in the sense that as prices increase, the economy will justify itself by, for example, people working in the community with their neighbors and not traveling so far, goods and services not, etc.
Yep, I mean, you're absolutely right, it's a corrective pressure. The peak oil thing, though, I mean, in one sense is absolutely terrifying, because peak oil won't be a nice, smooth transition to a place where we suddenly find cheap alternatives and we keep economic growth, but it just doesn't have oil in it. Actually, most of the sense of where peak oil goes, and some of the early Club of Rome people are thinking about this right now, is that as you approach the peak of a resource curve, things happen very, very fast. So it's not a place where you sort of have time to adjust. Actually, it's a place where you get very quickly into a totally different dynamic. So the energy that you need to get the oil out increases quite fast, and that has a positive feedback effect. That means you need more and more energy at exactly the point at which you have less and less energy, and that's actually the dynamic of a collapse. So that dynamic of a collapse actually is the one that the transition movement has taken on board. I mean, just to sort of end, if you like, with a positive, hopeful sort of sign, because that dynamic is scary, I think. Peak oil is not going to be a natural corrective mechanism. It's going to be a pretty scary place to be, unless, and this is what the transition town people are doing, they say, we need desperately, at this point, social mechanisms for what they call an energy descent, a place to get to a society which is less energy intensive, less resource intensive, but keeps hold of those social goods, keeps hold of community, keeps hold of social relationships, allows us still to have a quality of life. But you can't, what transition says is you need to be doing that now. You need that foresight. You need to be building resilience into community. You need to be building alternative ways of operating and delivering quality of life. You need better food systems. You need better transport systems. You need better sense of local energy infrastructure that you can invest in yourself and create resilience. And that's exactly the kind of transformation, in a way, at grassroots level, that needs to be supported and needs to provide a kind of avenue of hope for exactly that situation.
Okay, so given everything you said, I realized that we got it totally wrong tonight, because this lecture was free and you provided a brilliant service, but we're about to sell your books right at the back. And I want to point out to everyone, before I say thank you, that we have this space for the next half hour or 40 minutes. You're very much welcome to stay here to talk with Tim. The bar is still open. We have books, not only Tim's terrific book. I mean, this is an economics text that I lost my weekend to it. It was a great thing. But we've also got some of Charlie Pachter's books back there, best-selling Emma's for Moose, and the counting book as well, which is very popular. You can see this talk again and recommend it to your friends in a couple days' time on the Mass Vimeo website. We'll send out notice about that. If you're not on our mailing list, then you should go to masslbp.com. And if you're still curious a little bit about what we do,
then I think you'll find some answers there. But I want to thank everyone very much for coming this evening. I want to thank Charles Pachter for making the space available, to the British Council, to IPAC, to our friends at the Mark, and especially to Tim Jackson, who really exemplifies what we're trying to do with the Mass Talk series, which is to bring forward people who have big ideas shaping public discourse. I don't think the ideas you presented tonight can shape that discourse quickly enough. Thank you.
Thanks.